When Beyoncé's daughter Rumi joins an elite private school in Malibu, she hopes to shine on her own stage. But after a humiliating talent show and brutal bullying, she hides her pain until Beyoncé discovers the truth and plans something. The world won't forget. The hallway smelled like polished cedar wood and lavender-scented air diffusers, the kind of luxury you couldn't quite name, but always felt under your skin. It was Rumi's first week at the Ocean Vale Academy for Gifted Youth, a prestigious private school tucked high in the Malibu hills, guarded gates, Mediterranean architecture, and a student body dressed like child models walking straight out. A Vogue, 8 years old, hair in braided puffs, socks always too high, shoes always too clean, and a heart that beat like a quiet drum she kept hidden inside her. Rumi Carter knew she didn't belong, not really, not here, where most kids carried last names attached to hedge funds, oil empires, and movie studios. Sure, she was Beyoncé's daughter, and the teachers smiled a little too wide when they called attendance, but being seen was never the problem. It was what came after. Her twin, Sir, was in the lower building, in a class filled with kids obsessed with bugs, slime, and Minecraft. But Rumi wanted to dance, to sing. She'd watched her mother since she was 4, mimicking every hair, flip, every heel step, every note. Music was the only place she felt like herself, even when everything else was confusing and too loud. And now, the Ocean Vale Talent Showcase was approaching. The sign-up sheet went up one Monday morning. Her fingers trembled when she wrote her name in block letters. Rumi Carter. Singing, dancing. She walked away before she could change her mind. But Stephanie Pierce saw it, tall for her age, honey blonde with icy blue eyes, and a voice that always sounded like it was talking down to you. Daughter of a tech billionaire who had once tried to buy TikTok. Stephanie didn't just rule Ocean Vale, she curated it. Her word was law among the platinum lunchbox clique that followed her around like ducklings. Avery, Tessa, Cameron, Stephanie. Tilted her head, chewing on a piece of gum like it was someone's secret. Cute, she said loud enough for Rumi to hear. Someone's trying to be her mom. The night of the talent show arrived too fast. Her mom was out of town performing in Dubai, but Blue Ivy FaceTimed her during makeup, calming her nerves. You got this. Just be you. Don't try to be mom. Be Rumi. Her little hands clutched the mic as she walked on stage. Her pink sequin sneakers shimmered under the lights. Her voice shook as she began singing Love on Top, off-key. Her heel caught during the dance break. She stumbled, gasps, some polite applause, but also laughter. Rumi's eyes darted toward the third row. Stephanie's phone was up, recording. She fled the stage before the curtain could even close. What followed was an invisible unraveling. Stephanie was smart. She never bullied in front of teachers, but in whispered insults, weaponized glances, and orchestrated exclusion, she made Ocean Vale hell. Maybe you should auto-tune next time. She's only here because her mom's famous. Chocolate Barbie thinks she's a star. They laughed behind manicured hands, spread rumors, changed group partners at the last second, so Rumi was always alone. Cameron even made a TikTok parody of the performance, distorted voice and all. It racked up views before the teachers could delete it, and Rumi said nothing. Each day she shrank a little more. Her hairstyles got simpler, her eyes got duller. Her lunchbox started coming home untouched. Her silence became armor, thick and heavy. She didn't want to tell her mom, because what if Beyoncé saw her as weak, a disappointment? She was supposed to shine, not break. But one night changed everything. It was a Wednesday. Her face was lit by the soft glow of her iPad as she scrolled mindlessly through old dance routines. She didn't hear Beyoncé enter the room. Her mom sat on the edge of the bed, placing a warm hand on her foot. "You've been quiet lately," Beyoncé said softly. Rumi blinked, eyes darting away. "Just tired." From what? Pause. "Long, too long." Beyoncé's voice dropped lower, the way it did when she was listening with her soul. "Baby, talk to me." And it all spilled out. Broken sobs, shame, the moment on stage, the whispers, The tick-tock, how she couldn't breathe in the hallways, how she hated being Beyoncé's daughter when all it got her was pain, how she just wanted to disappear. Beyoncé's face didn't flinch, but her jaw clenched once. Tight, fierce. "I'm sorry, Mama," Rumi whispered. Beyoncé took her hands, kissed each one. Her eyes shimmered, but her voice was steel. "Never be sorry for telling your truth." Another. Silence. Then Beyoncé stood, walked over to the window. She looked out into the Malibu night, moonlight on water, a quiet storm building in her chest. "I could talk to the principal. I could call a board meeting. But that won't fix this." She turned. "I'm going to do something different." Rumi tilted her head. "What?" Her mother smiled, but not sweetly. It was the kind of smile people feared backstage. "I'm going to remind them who we are." And in the hush that followed, the wheels of something bigger began to turn. Beyoncé had been quiet too long. The world was about to listen. But first, Beyoncé listened to everything. She sat with Rumi for hours that night, wrapped around her daughter like armor. The pain she'd tried to hide spilled out in scattered memories and soft hiccups between words. Each story dug deeper, the silent lunches, the crooked grins from teachers who looked the other way, the tick-tocks that haunted her dreams. And in every confession, Beyoncé felt a mother's heartbreak harden into something sharper, not just outrage, but resolve. She kissed Rumi's forehead, whispered, "Rest. Now, Mama's got this." But sleep didn't come easy for either of them. The next morning, Beyoncé didn't send an assistant. She didn't make a call or draft an email. She drove. No makeup, no entourage. Hair swept back into a low bun. Just jeans, a fitted black turtleneck, and a stare that could slice through lies like glass. She stepped into Oceanvale Academy just after drop-off, the golden morning sun casting her shadow. Long across the marble lobby, phones slipped from hands. A receptionist gasped audibly, then scrambled to stand. "Mrs. Carter, Beyoncé, miss, I'm here to speak to Headmaster Winslow," she said calmly. A pause. "I'll let him know you're here." As the woman fumbled for the intercom, Beyoncé's eyes swept the school's pristine interior, cascading ivy, glistening banners, plaques lining the walls, words like excellence, tradition, legacy. It made her stomach turn. 10 minutes later, she was seated in a dark leather chair, across from Headmaster Winslow's polished mahogany desk. He looked every bit the part. Silver hair, tailored navy suit, the gentle smile of a man trained to neutralize scandal before it made the morning news. "Mrs. Carter," he said smoothly, "it's truly an honor to welcome you here in person." "This isn't a visit," Beyoncé said. "It's a reckoning." His smile faltered. She leaned forward. "My daughter has been bullied every day for the last 5 months by students you reward with lid rolls and science fair ribbons, students whose families donate just enough to buy silence, and you allowed it." Winslow raised a hand, measured, and rehearsed. "I'm deeply sorry Rumi has had a difficult time adjusting, but I assure you, Oceanvale takes all allegations seriously. If you'll allow us to begin a formal investigation—" "No," he blinked. "I'm not here for a formality," she said, voice cool. "I'm here because my daughter was humiliated, targeted for her skin, her talent, and her last name. And she suffered in silence because she thought I'd be disappointed. Do you understand what that means? She thought being my daughter was a burden." The headmaster's throat tightened. "I understand this is emotional." "It's not emotional. It's systemic." And then, slowly, Beyoncé slid a folder across the table. He opened it. Inside were stills, screenshots from the now-deleted TikTok parody, private group chats, texts between Stephanie's clique that used slurs, memes, cruel captions. Some even mocked Rumi's broken little voice. A single page, at the bottom, held a list of donors. Highlighted were the parents of every girl in the clique. Headmaster Winslow's mouth opened, then closed. "I suggest you look closely," Beyoncé said, "because when this goes public, and it will, You'll need a better excuse than "we didn't know." She stood. "I'm launching a program, not just for Rumi. For every black and brown student in elite institutions who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. We're calling it Stage Light, because some kids don't need a spotlight handed to them. They are the light. They just need space to shine. And Ocean Vale," she added, stepping toward the door, "will be our first partner or our first cautionary tale." The silence behind her was deafening. Meanwhile, Rumi sat in the back of the art room during second period, barely moving her brush. She was supposed to paint a self-portrait, but all she'd drawn was a single brown line across the paper. Thick, uncertain. The whispering had already started again. "Her mom's here. I bet someone's getting expelled, probably trying to buy her way into the talent show again." Stephanie sat 2 tables over, dabbing perfect pinks and blues onto her canvas, like she wasn't the villain of someone else's story. Rumi glanced up. Their eyes met. Stephanie smirked, and Rumi felt it. The slow boil in her chest, hotter than embarrassment, thicker than fear. She didn't cry this time. She stared back, hard, her brush trembling in her fingers. She still didn't know who she was at this school, but she knew who she wasn't anymore. That night at home, Rumi watched her mother speak live on Instagram. Over 600,000 viewers tuned in within the first minute. "I want to talk about what it means to be the child of someone famous," Beyoncé began, "and what it means to be a black girl in a room full of people who don't want you to win." She didn't name Ocean Vale directly. She didn't need to. The internet exploded. The next morning, the headlines followed. "Beyoncé speaks out on bullying in elite schools. Stage Light initiative targets racism. Exclusion in private education. Beyoncé, my daughter, will never shrink to fit someone else's comfort." Emails flooded the Ocean Vale inbox. Parents, alumni, reporters, advocates. And at lunch, when Rumi walked into the courtyard, the noise died. Stephanie looked up from her table. Cameron's phone was out, but this time she wasn't recording. She was watching Beyoncé. Avery muttered, "Are we in trouble?" And Stephanie's voice, once icy and smug, faltered, "I think, yeah." But this wasn't over. Not yet, because the school announced an emergency assembly, because Beyoncé would be attending, because the bullies weren't used to being held accountable, because Rumi still hadn't spoken for herself, and because behind Stephanie's silence, a different kind of storm was brewing, the kind that doesn't strike loud and fast, the kind that builds, slow, creeping, coiled like a serpent, waiting in the tall grass. Stephanie Pierce was used to attention, but not this kind. Not the kind where her name was whispered in uncertainty, not reverence. Her world had shifted overnight, like someone pulled the rug and left her standing on glass. At home, her parents hadn't said much, just sharp whispers behind closed doors and a too-long silence at breakfast. Her father gripped his phone tighter than usual, checking updates from Ocean Vale's board, pacing around the house like it might collapse under scandal. "You'll apologize if they ask," he said once, without looking at her. Stephanie didn't answer. Her stomach clenched. She'd never been told to apologize before. Not really. Now the entire school buzzed with tension. Everyone knew about the emergency assembly that afternoon. Everyone knew Beyoncé would be speaking. No one knew what she would say. Rumi stood in front of the bathroom mirror, still and quiet, as her sister Blue gently tugged the final braid into place. Blue had skipped her own classes to be there. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. "You ready?" she asked, tying a silver ribbon at the end of the braid. "No," Rumi admitted, "but I don't want to be scared anymore." Blue smiled and pressed her forehead to Rumi's. "That's ready enough." The auditorium was packed wall to wall. Students filled every chair, their uniforms crisp, hair tidy. Teachers lined the sides, fidgeting, some murmuring to each other. A few parents sat in the back, arms crossed, phones on silent, but ready. The media wasn't allowed, but the tension in the room said this moment was already history, and then she walked in. Beyoncé. No, spotlight needed. The room dimmed around her presence, like the walls themselves recognized royalty. She wore white, a blazer and wide-legged trousers, no jewelry, no glitz, just purpose. Rumi followed beside her. The whispering began the moment they stepped on stage. The same stage where she'd stumbled weeks before, the same floor where her voice had cracked and laughter had echoed like thunder in her ears. But today it was silent. So silent she could hear her own breathing. She didn't hold her mother's hand. She stood on her own, small, still, brave. Headmaster Winslow cleared his throat at the mic, reading prepared remarks. Apologies, commitments, policy changes, it all blurred. Then Beyoncé stepped forward. The auditorium leaned forward with her. "My daughter," she began, "did something most adults struggle to do. She told the truth." Murmurs flickered across the crowd. "She told me about humiliation, cruelty, and racism. Right here, at a school that promises to nurture greatness." She didn't shout. Her voice was steady, clear. That made it worse. She turned slightly, eyes sweeping across the rows. Greatness isn't a privilege. It's not something you gatekeep with money, skin color, or performance. Greatness is something every child walks in with. You either water it or you try to crush it. She paused, then nodded toward Rumi, who stepped forward slowly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some ashamed, some unreadable. And then her eyes landed on Stephanie, in the second row, arms folded, lips tight. "I thought I had to be perfect to deserve to belong," Rumi said. "But that's a lie. I do belong, even if I mess up, even if I sing off key, even if you don't like me." Her voice wavered, but she didn't stop. "I don't want anyone else to feel how I felt. So I'm going to speak up now. For me, for other kids like me, for the ones who stay quiet because they think their voice doesn't matter." She turned to Beyoncé, who nodded, and then something unexpected happened. A student stood up, a boy from the back row, Asian American, shy, usually silent. His voice broke the stillness. "She's not the only one. I get made fun of every time I bring homemade lunch. They call it fish food. I've never told anyone." Another voice followed, a girl. "They laugh at my accent. I started faking my voice just to blend in." Then a teacher. "I've seen it. We've all seen it." And we stayed quiet. One by one, voices rose, small cracks in the wall, then whole fractures. And in the second row, Stephanie felt her breath catch, because the power she'd held over this place was slipping. Her hand clenched the edge of her seat. Her friends, Cameron Avery, weren't looking at her. They were looking away. And when Rumi stepped down from the stage, the room didn't erupt in applause. It stood still, reverent, like something sacred had just happened. Afterward, in the courtyard, the quiet was heavier than noise. Rumi sat on a stone bench, beneath a blooming cherry tree, pulling at a loose thread on her sleeve. She wasn't sure how to feel, strong, relieved, hollow. Then she heard footsteps. Stephanie. Rumi looked up slowly. Stephanie didn't speak for a long time. Her perfect posture was slouched. Her eyes, usually hard, unreadable, were rimmed red. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," she said quietly. Rumi blinked. "Oh, do what?" "Stand up there. Say all that." "I had to," Rumi said. "You gave me no choice." Stephanie stared at her. "You know what sucks? I don't even know why I hated you so much. I think I just wanted to be you. And I didn't." "Know how?" Rumi narrowed her eyes. "That's not an excuse." "It's not," Stephanie said, "but it's the truth." A long silence passed between them. Not forgiving, not warm, just real. "I'm not saying sorry to make it go away," Stephanie added. "But I am sorry." Rumi didn't respond, not with words, but she nodded just once. Enough to say, "I heard you. But we're not done." Stephanie turned and walked away, slower than usual. No strut, no whispering entourage. And Rumi, for the first time in a long while, sat with herself, not trying to shrink, not trying to disappear, just breathing. But the story wasn't finished, because now the world was watching. And not everyone was clapping. Emails had started rolling into Beyoncé's foundation, most grateful, some venomous. Other schools were being called out, lawsuits were being threatened, the cracks were spreading, and powerful people didn't. Like cracks. And somewhere, in a boardroom 3 states away, a familiar last name was circled in red on a donor list. Beyoncé wants to shake the system, one man said. Let's see how she handles it when the system pushes back. The room was cold, sterile, lit with artificial fluorescence that made everyone's skin look a little more gray. Around a sleek conference table, 9 men and women in dark suits sat straight-backed, brows creased in quiet panic. The meeting was confidential, but the objective was clear. Beyoncé's Stage Light initiative had gone viral. The program aimed at supporting marginalized students in elite schools was not only gathering nationwide attention, but also stirring discomfort in institutions. Used to silence, institutions that thrived off exclusivity. A handful of private schools had already been named in exposés published by popular youth blogs and grassroots education movements. The PR teams were swamped. Endowments were nervous. Sponsors, wealthy, powerful ones, were watching. And Ocean Vale Academy? It was ground zero. She's not just making this about her daughter, a woman in tortoiseshell glasses muttered. She's making this a movement. And movements, someone else added, cost money. They cost control. A man near the head of the table, a sharp-featured executive from the Pierce Foundation, Stephanie's father, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. We let this snowball and more of our schools lose enrollment. We lose donors. We lose the narrative. So what do? He didn't hesitate. We fight back. Back in Malibu, Rumi wasn't thinking about any of that. She was lying on the floor of her bedroom, sketching in a wide spiral notebook. No pressure. No project due. Just space. The crumpled pages around her were evidence of false starts. Pages filled with half-drawn stars, microphone doodles, fragments of lyrics she was too nervous to show anyone yet. But her pencil kept moving. Every so often, she paused, humming a melody under her breath. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was hers. The soft knock at the door didn't surprise her. "Mama!" she called out. The door opened and Beyoncé stepped in, slightly more tired than usual. She'd just flown back from a whirlwind meeting with activists and education leaders in New York. Her heels clicked gently against the hardwood floor. "How's my superstar?" she asked, easing onto the rug beside her. Rumi smiled faintly. "Drawing." Beyoncé tilted her head, peeking at the page. "That a stage?" Rumi nodded. "Kind of. It's a floating one, like not attached to anything. It just hovers in the middle of the sky." Her mother grinned. "That's beautiful. I wanted to make one where I couldn't fall." Silence. Beyoncé looked at her daughter, and the words hit her deeper than any speech she'd given. She reached for the sketchbook, but Rumi pulled it back. "Not finished yet." "Okay," Beyoncé whispered. And then, after a breath, she added, "You might hear some noise soon. About me, about the program. Bad noise. Scared noise." Rumi thought about that. Will they try to stop it? Some will. But that doesn't mean we stop. Another beat of quiet. "Even if they yell?" Rumi asked. "Even if they lie?" "Especially then." 2 days later it began. Articles appeared casting Stage Light as an overreach. One headline read, "Celebrity Interference? Are elite schools under siege by celebrity activism?" Others were worse. Anonymous sources claimed Rumi had received special treatment from Ocean Vale's staff, that she fabricated details to boost her mother's movement. One blog even dug into old security footage from the talent show, editing together a reel designed to mock her stumble. Again, Rumi found it by accident while scrolling through YouTube. Her hands turned cold. She didn't cry this time. She just shut the screen off and sat very, very still. Downstairs, Beyoncé was already on the phone with her legal team, voice low, pacing, deadly calm. Blue Ivy read the headlines, fists clenched. Sir didn't fully understand what was happening, but he sat by Rumi's side with a coloring book and didn't say a word. Even at Ocean Vale, the shift was palpable. Support had turned into side eyes. Some parents pulled their kids out of the assembly video that had gone viral. A few teachers stopped greeting Beyoncé at drop-off. An anonymous email circulated among staff. "We can't let public pressure dictate private education." It stung. But Beyoncé had expected this. She'd studied the game too long not to know its rules. One night, she sat at her grand piano in the dim light of the music room, hands moving slowly over the keys. The melody was soft, a whisper of something not quite written yet. Rumi crept in without a sound and sat beside her on the bench. "Is this for the new album?" she asked. "No," Beyoncé said. "This one's just healing." Rumi watched. The way her mother's fingers moved, graceful, even when uncertain. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked. "All the time, but you don't show it. I show it to the right people, people who understand what fear can become." "What?" "Power." That weekend, Beyoncé released a short video, no press, no edits, just her speaking, directly to the camera, the same way she had when Stage Light first launched. She named the publications smearing her daughter. She named the systems protecting the bullies. She named the price of silence and who pays it. Then, she did something that caught everyone off guard. She invited Ocean Vale and any other school under scrutiny to host an open forum led by students for students. No press, no adults speaking over them, just kids sharing, and she challenged every headmaster, teacher, and parent who had ever claimed to be committed to change to listen. No headlines. No hashtags, just ears open and mouths closed, she said. It worked. The forums began, some quiet, some messy, some beautiful. Rumi spoke at the first one. By the end of the month, Stage Light had expanded to 3 more schools, and then 5. The noise hadn't stopped, but something louder was rising beneath it. Voices, but not everyone was rising. At the next school board meeting, a vote was called. A group of donors, including Stephanie's father, had proposed a new clause in Ocean Vale's charter, a clause that would limit external influence in school policy, a clause that would quietly dismantle Beyoncé's ability to work with Ocean Vale from the inside. A clause they planned to pass, and if they did, Stage Light could be shut out from the very school where it began. Rumi had no idea the meeting was even happening, but someone else did, Stephanie. She stood outside the boardroom, frozen in place. Her father's voice carried through the cracked door. Slick, controlled, strategic. They want chaos. We offer stability. Stephanie's stomach turned because she knew what this was. This wasn't about education. It wasn't even about Beyoncé. It was about keeping kids like Rumi in their place. And Stephanie, finally, had to make a choice. The carpet beneath her shoes felt impossibly soft, but her legs were stiff, locked in place. The words drifting through the half-open door weren't new to her. She'd grown up around this kind of language. Phrases like protecting tradition, maintaining standards, not yielding to external pressure. But what she heard, now standing in the hall outside the Ocean Vale boardroom, didn't feel like protection. It felt like control. It felt like fear masquerading as leadership. Her father's voice rose again, smooth, familiar, the tone he used in meetings with investors or interviews on Bloomberg. "We're not saying Beyoncé isn't entitled to her personal views, he was saying, but that doesn't mean her foundation belongs in the decision-making spaces of this institution. Ocean Vale is a school, not a stage." Soft chuckles followed. Stephanie clenched her fists. She thought of the assembly. Rumi's voice on the microphone, shaking but clear. The students who stood with her. The truth they poured out, not just about what happened in the courtyard, but about what was buried deeper, the parts everyone pretended not to see. And she thought of what she'd said to Rumi. "I just wanted to be you." That memory burned like a fresh scratch across her ribs. And maybe this was her moment, not to be Rumi, but to become someone she didn't hate. She took a step forward. Then another. Inside. The boardroom, Headmaster Winslow sat at the far end of the long, polished table, his hands folded, his brow lined with strain. Around him, the members of the board were locked in quiet debate, some already tapping pens, ready to vote. "Let's move to a vote," one member said. "We've all had time to review the clause." Stephanie's father nodded. "We need to restore balance. This is about protecting the integrity of the school." The headmaster reached for the gavel, then froze as the door creaked open. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Stephanie Pierce stepped into the room, her spine straight, her face pale but determined. "Excuse me," she said. Her father's face changed instantly. "Stephanie, this isn't the time." "It is," she cut in, "because you're voting on something that affects me and everyone I go to school with, and I'm not going to let you do that without hearing the truth." No one moved, no one interrupted, so she spoke. "I know why this vote is happening," she said. "I know it's because my dad and people like him think Beyoncé embarrassed them, that she came into this school and made us all look bad." Her eyes flicked to her father, and for once he said nothing. "But you should be embarrassed, not because of her, because of us. Because I bullied a girl for being different, because no one stopped me, because we all smiled and called it girls. Being girls while Rumi went home crying." A breath. "I started it, but the system let me. It gave me power I didn't earn. And when Rumi spoke up, she didn't just stand up for herself. She gave the rest of us a chance to do better." "And you're going to punish her for that? For making us face what we've ignored?" Silence thickened the air. "Then," she added softly, "you want to protect this school's reputation? Start by protecting the kids inside it." She turned toward the door. "You don't need my permission to vote, but now you can't pretend you didn't know." And she left, leaving behind the echo of something that couldn't be unsaid. The vote did not pass. Later that evening, Beyoncé sat at the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a cup of ginger tea, her eyes scanning the email that had just landed in her inbox. The subject line read, "Board decision, stage light will continue." Her breath left her in a long, steady stream. She looked up to find Rumi standing in the doorway. "Is it over?" Rumi asked. Beyoncé shook her head slowly. "No, baby, it's just starting. But we're not being stopped." Rumi's face didn't light up the way it might have months ago. She didn't jump into her mother's arms or squeal with glee. She just exhaled. It was the sound of weight being let go. The next week, Ocean Vale held its first stage light student forum. No cameras, no press, just students. Rumi sat in the circle of folding chairs under the open sky. There were other kids there now, more than she'd expected. She saw familiar faces, some who had once looked through her, now looking at her. Blue sat nearby, not as a chaperone, but as a witness. Sir ran around in the grass behind them, chasing butterflies, occasionally tripping and laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. And then, unexpectedly, Stephanie arrived. No designer backpack, no entourage, just her. She walked over, quietly, and took a seat beside Rumi. Not too close, just enough. And this time, she didn't speak first. Rumi did. "Thanks," she said. Stephanie nodded. "It's not enough, but it's a start." They sat side by side, watching as more students stood and spoke. Stories spilled, some painful, some brave, some filled with cautious hope. Not every voice trembled. Not every story ended in triumph, but the words kept coming, building something. Between them, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. By spring, Stage Light had reached schools in Chicago, Atlanta, and London. Rumi's story inspired a short documentary that made its way to Sundance. Beyoncé kept her promise, not just to her daughter, but to a generation. She funded scholarships, built curriculum, trained school leaders, but most of all, She made space for kids to lead. And Rumi, she sang again. At Ocean Vale's spring showcase, her name appeared last on the program. She stood alone on stage wearing lavender sneakers and a small silver mic. No glitter, no backup dancers, just her voice. She started quiet, breathy. The room leaned in. And then she soared. It wasn't flawless, but it was free. When the final note fell into silence, the audience rose in waves, not because she was Beyoncé's daughter, but because she was Rumi. After the show, as the crowd spilled out into the garden, Beyoncé wrapped her arms around her daughter. "You proud?" she whispered. Rumi didn't answer right away. She looked around, at her teachers, at her classmates, at her old bullies, her new friends, her family. Then she looked up at the stars. "I think I finally found my floating stage," she said. Beyoncé smiled, her eyes full of something that reached beyond words. "I always knew you would." And just like that, the light stayed on, not on a stage, but in the hearts of every kid who watched Rumi stand tall and realized they could too.